In ancient Sparta, the survival of the state came before individual life. From birth, every child was evaluated to determine whether they were strong enough to serve the military-driven society. Newborns were brought before a council of elders, and if the baby was deemed weak, deformed, or sickly, they were taken to a place near Mount Taygetus, known as the Apartheid, and left to die. The practice was intended to ensure that only the healthiest and strongest would live to serve Sparta. This wasn't done in secret, it was an accepted and normalized part of Spartan life. Strength, endurance, and physical perfection were not just encouraged, they were enforced. Babies were often bathed in wine rather than water, a practice believed to test their resilience. Those who survived early inspections were raised under a brutal regime that prioritized discipline and military readiness above all else. In ancient Rome, slavery was not just accepted, but deeply woven into the fabric of society. Estimates suggest that between 30 to 40% of the population in Roman Italy were slaves, many of whom were prisoners of war, debtors, or born into servitude. Under Roman law, slaves were considered property, not people. This legal classification gave their owners complete authority over them. A slave could be bought, sold, beaten, or even killed without any legal consequence for the master. Although a few laws emerged to slightly limit cruelty, these changes were minimal and rarely enforced. Gladiators, often mistaken for mere entertainers, were usually slaves trained to fight for public amusement. They were kept in special schools called ludi, where they underwent harsh physical training and strict discipline. All gladiators were placed under a legal status called infamia, meaning they were stripped of legal and social protections. They could not vote, hold public office, or even make legal wills. Even successful fighters remained stigmatized. Some, however, could earn their freedom by surviving multiple battles and receiving a wooden sword called a rudis, which symbolized emancipation. The Justinian Code was one of the most influential legal reforms in ancient history. It was commissioned by Emperor Justinian I of the Byzantine Empire and completed by the year 534. The goal is to simplify and organize centuries of complex and often conflicting Roman laws into one unified legal system. Although many good things came from this reform, one of the components of it addressed current social and political issues, including matters of property, inheritance, and criminal behavior. The code emphasized a strict moral and religious tone. For example, adultery, homosexuality, and heresy were not just sins, but crimes punishable by severe penalties. Non-Christians were banned from holding public office, and pagan practices were outlawed. The state used the law to reinforce religious orthodoxy and political unity. The code also reinforced a rigid social hierarchy. It granted men dominance over women and maintained slaveholding as legal. The Justinian Code remained the legal foundation of the Byzantine Empire for centuries and was later rediscovered in Western Europe during the Middle Ages. It became the basis for many modern civil law systems around the world. Despite its harsh elements, it resulted in a major advancement in the structure and clarity of law, showing how legal reform could be used to control, educate, and unify an empire. In medieval Europe, heresy was not just a spiritual matter. It became a serious legal offense that could lead to arrest, torture, and death. From as early as the 11th century, people who challenged the teachings of the Catholic Church faced punishment. In 1022, a group in France was burned alive for spreading beliefs seen as dangerous. This event marked one of the earliest known executions for heresy in Europe. As the fear of heresy grew, the Church began working closely with kings and rulers to pass laws against it. In 1184, Pope Lucius III issued a major decree called Ad Abolendum. It required bishops to search for heretics in their areas and punish anyone found guilty. People who supported or protected heretics were punished too. Those convicted could lose their property, their legal rights, or be excommunicated from the church. In England, laws against heresy became even more intense in the 1400s. A law called De Heretico Comburendo was passed in 1401. It allowed the state to burn heretics alive. Just a few years later, the 1414 Suppression of Heresy Act gave secular courts the power to arrest people suspected of heresy and hand them over to church authorities for punishment. During the 1500s, especially under Queen Mary I of England, laws against heresy were brought back to target Protestants. Hundreds of people were executed during this period, often by being burned at the stake. It was not until 1677 that the English Parliament passed a law ending the death penalty for heresy. These laws were designed to protect the church's authority, but they also silenced free thought and punished people simply for asking questions or holding different beliefs. The Spanish Encomienda system was a colonial labor structure established in the early 1500s. It granted Spanish settlers, known as encomenderos, the right to collect tribute and forced labor from indigenous communities in the Americas and the Philippines. In return, the encomenderos were expected to offer protection, religious instruction, and basic welfare. However, in practice, the system became a tool of exploitation. Indigenous people were forced to work in dangerous mines, fields, and construction under extremely harsh conditions. Many died from overwork, starvation, disease, and violence. Although the Spanish crown introduced regulations like the laws of Burgos in 1512 and the new laws in 1542 to limit abuse, enforcement was weak. The encomienda system eventually declined and was replaced by other exploitative models like the repartimiento and the hacienda. While it was phased out by the 18th century, its impact was long-lasting. It devastated indigenous populations, disrupted social systems, and laid the groundwork for continued economic inequality and racial hierarchies throughout Latin America. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, European and colonial governments passed a series of powerful laws targeting witchcraft. These statutes reflected deep fears of magic, heresy, and social disruption, and they often sanctioned torture, public trial, and execution. The first major law was the Maleficium Statutes, passed in various German states in the late 15th century. These laws classified the use of harmful magic as a crime against both individuals and the state. Accusations could lead to property seizure, imprisonment, torture to forced confession, and execution, often by burning or hanging. In 1563, England passed the Witchcraft Act under Queen Elizabeth I. This statute made practicing witchcraft or using it to harm others a felony. Those convicted were punished with execution. The law expanded in 1604 under King James I, increasing penalties for both harmful and alleged harmless magic. This led to a wave of trials and executions across England. During the 17th century, colonial America enacted its own versions. The Massachusetts Bay Colony first punished witchcraft by death in 1647. Its 1692 Witchcraft Act laid the groundwork for the Salem witch trials, which resulted in the execution of 20 people after accusations rooted in mass panic. In 1735, Great Britain overhauled its approach. The Witchcraft Act made it a crime to claim magical powers or to accuse others of witchcraft. At this point, laws no longer punished actual magic. Lastly, in 1951, the United Kingdom repealed previous laws, with the Fraudulent Mediums Act effectively ending legal targeting of witchcraft. Other countries followed, though remnants remained. Ireland abolished its Witchcraft Act in 2001, and some former British colonies maintained statutes into the 20th century. The Witchcraft Acts transformed private beliefs into criminal threats and legitimized torture and execution in the name of protecting social cohesion. The transatlantic slave trade, spanning from the 16th to the 19th century, was enabled and protected by a series of formal laws passed by European governments. These laws helped legalize the capture, transport, and forced labor of millions of Africans across the Atlantic Ocean. European colonial powers such as Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands used legal systems to turn slavery into an organized industry. One of the earliest legal instruments was the Asiento de Negros, issued by the Spanish crown. It granted companies or nations the right to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies. In 1713, Britain received the Asiento through the Treaty of Utrecht, allowing them to legally deliver thousands of enslaved Africans each year to Spanish territories. In the colonies, laws known as slave codes were introduced. The 1661 Barbados Slave Code is one of the earliest examples. It established that enslaved people were property and had no personal rights. These laws allowed owners to punish enslaved people without legal consequences, and was later adopted in various British and American colonies. By the late 18th century, public opposition to the slave trade grew stronger. In Britain, the Slave Trade Act of 1788, also called Dolben's Act, was the first step towards reform. It aimed to reduce overcrowding on slave ships by limiting the number of enslaved people allowed per ton of ship weight. In 1807, Britain passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act, which made it illegal to carry enslaved Africans on British ships. To enforce this law, the Royal Navy created the West Africa Squadron, which patrolled the Atlantic, intercepted slave ships, and freed those on board. International efforts followed. In 1841, several European countries signed the Treaty for the Suppression of the African Slave Trade, allowing their navies to cooperate in stopping illegal slave shipments. Though slavery itself would persist for decades, these laws were critical in challenging the legal foundation of one of the most inhumane systems in history. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act into law, authorizing the forced relocation of Native American tribes living east of the Mississippi River. This law granted the president power to negotiate land exchange treaties, often using coercion rather than fair diplomacy. The official policy aimed to open valuable land for white settlers and further economic development in the Southeast. Within a few years, state and federal agents began negotiating treaties that forced tribes like the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Seminole, and more to give up millions of acres of their ancestral land. These treaties frequently promised money, supplies, and land in large open territories, mainly in present-day Oklahoma, but those promises were often broken or delivered late. The forced removal became known as the Trail of Tears for the Cherokee. In 1838, U.S. soldiers rounded up nearly 16,000 Cherokee and forced them to march over 1,000 miles. More than 4,000 people died of disease, malnutrition, or exhaustion. Other tribes suffered similarly, where thousands died during relocations due to delays, poor planning, and lack of support. Despite opposition from groups like the Missionary Press and some politicians, federal authorities continued removal policies for nearly 2 decades. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously in Worcester v. Georgia that Georgia had no authority over Cherokee lands. President Jackson reportedly ignored that decision. His administration pushed ahead, using both political and military means to enforce removal. The Indian Removal Act caused cultural disaster, uprooting generations of Native American communities. Survivors lost sacred sites, ancestral burial grounds, and the environmental knowledge tied to their homelands. They were resettled in unfamiliar territories, with new ecological challenges and social tensions. Following the end of Reconstruction in 1877, Southern states in the United States began passing a series of racial segregation laws known as Jim Crow laws. These laws institutionalized the separation of black and white people across nearly every aspect of public life. The name Jim Crow originated from a derogatory caricature used in minstrel shows and came to represent a legal system of racial inequality. Jim Crow laws mandated the use of separate facilities for black and white citizens. This applied to schools, parks, restaurants, hospitals, theaters, public transportation, restrooms, and drinking fountains. Although the Supreme Court's 1896 decision in Plessy v. Ferguson ruled that such segregation was constitutional under the separate but equal doctrine, the facilities and services provided to black people were consistently inferior. These laws also imposed barriers to political participation. Mechanisms like literary tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses were introduced to disenfranchise black voters. In Louisiana, for example, black voter registration dropped from over 130,000 in 1896 to just 1,300 by 1904. Interracial marriage was outlawed in many states, and legal protections for black citizens were often ignored or selectively applied. The Jim Crow system began to unravel in the mid-20th century. The 1954 Supreme Court ruling in Brown v. Board of Education declared segregation in public schools unconstitutional. This was followed by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which formally dismantled legal segregation and protected voting rights. However, the effects of Jim Crow laws did not disappear overnight. Economic disparity, voter suppression tactics, and unequal treatment in the justice system remain significant issues. In 1935, the Nazi regime in Germany introduced the Nuremberg Laws, which stripped Jews and other targeted groups of their legal rights and citizenship. These laws were a turning point institutionalizing racial discrimination, setting the groundwork for the Holocaust. There were 2 core laws. The first was the Reich Citizenship Law, which declared that only individuals of German or related blood could be full citizens of the Reich. Jews, even those who had lived in Germany for generations, were downgraded to state subjects with no political rights. The second law was the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor. It prohibited marriages and sexual relationships between Jews and non-Jews. German women under the age of 45 were also forbidden from working in Jewish households, based on the false assumption that such arrangements posed moral risks. These laws defined Jewish identity using racial criteria. Anyone with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents were classified as Jewish, regardless of their religious beliefs or self-identification. People with 1 or 2 Jewish grandparents were labeled as mixed-race individuals and faced a different set of restrictions depending on the extent of their Jewish ancestry. Because of these laws, Jews were expelled from public service, schools, and many professions such as law and medicine. Jewish businesses were boycotted and marked for targeting. Passports of Jewish citizens were stamped with a J, and later, Jews were required to wear a yellow Star of David in public. These laws helped isolate Jews from the rest of society and made their persecution seem legally justified. Over time, the discrimination became more severe, leading to mass property seizures, deportations, and extermination. Apartheid was a system of institutionalized racial segregation that governed South Africa from 1948 to the early 1900s. It was made up of a series of laws that legally separated people by race, with the white minority maintaining dominance over the black majority and other racial groups. Though racial discrimination in South America had existed long before, the National Party's victory in 1948 made apartheid official state policy. Under apartheid, everyone in the country was categorized as either white, black, colored, mixed race, or Indian. Each group had different rights, restrictions, and designated areas to live and work. The cornerstone of this system was the Population Registration Act of 1950, which required all South Africans to be racially classified. This was followed by laws like Group Areas Act, which dictated where each race could reside. Entire communities were uprooted and relocated, often with violent force. Black South Africans were especially targeted. They were denied citizenship and instead considered citizens of so-called homelands, which were often poor, underdeveloped regions. Movement was restricted by past laws that forced black citizens to carry identification documents at all times and obtain permits to enter urban areas. Interracial marriage and sexual relations were criminalized under the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act and the Immortality Act. The apartheid government also limited access to education and employment. Black schools were underfunded, and economic opportunities were tightly controlled. Opposition to apartheid grew both inside and outside the country. Activists like Nelson Mandela and organizations like the African National Congress led resistance movements. International pressure also mounted, with countries imposing sanctions on South Africa. After decades of struggle, apartheid laws were gradually dismantled. In 1990, Nelson Mandela was released from prison, and by 1994, South Africa held its first democratic elections. Mandela became president, and apartheid officially ended. Between the 1930s and the end of World War II, the Japanese Imperial Army operated a vast system of military-run brothels across its occupied territories. These facilities were known as comfort stations, and the women forced to serve there came to be known as comfort women. It is estimated that between 50,000 and 200,000 women were taken into the system. Most were from Korea, China, and the Philippines, and other countries across Southeast Asia. The recruitment methods were often deceptive. Some women were tricked with offers to legitimate employment, such as nursing or factory work. Others were kidnapped from their homes or taken from the streets. Once inside these comfort stations, women were subjected to repeated sexual violence, often by multiple soldiers per day. They had no personal freedom, lived in harsh conditions, and were frequently denied medical care. Many contracted diseases or suffered lasting physical and emotional trauma. The Japanese military justified the creation of comfort stations as a way to prevent random acts of forced non-consensual sex by soldiers and to control the spread of sexually transmitted diseases. In reality, it was a highly organized system of sexual slavery that served to keep military morale high while dehumanizing women. After the war, the issue remained largely unspoken for decades. Many survivors faced stigma in their home countries and remained silent. It wasn't until the 1990s that former comfort women began to share their stories publicly. Their testimonies brought international attention to the scale and cruelty of the system. Japan has since issued several official apologies and set up the Asian Women's Fund in 1995 to provide some financial assistance. Still, many survivors and human rights organizations felt that these efforts did not go far enough. In 1980, China officially introduced the one-child policy as a nationwide effort to control the country's rapidly growing population. Chinese leaders feared that continued population expansion would strain limited natural resources, hinder economic development, and overwhelm social infrastructure like education and healthcare. The policy mostly applied to Han Chinese in urban areas. ethnic minorities were often exempt, and some royal families were allowed a second child if the first was a girl. The enforcement of the law was severe. Couples who had more than one child faced significant financial penalties, loss of employment, exclusion from state benefits, and social punishment. In many cases, local officials were under intense pressure to meet birth quotas, which led to reported cases of forced abortions and sterilizations. These practices, while officially discouraged, were carried out in numerous provinces and contributed to international criticism. The social consequences were profound. In a society with a long-standing cultural preference for male children, many families resorted to sex-selective abortions, abandonment of baby girls, or even female infanticide. This led to a noticeable gender imbalance, where men significantly outnumbered women. The gender disparity has caused long-term demographic challenges, including a rise in social issues such as human trafficking and difficulties for men in finding spouses. By 2015, China began to recognize the unintended consequences of the policy, especially an aging population and shrinking workforce. The government first shifted to a two-child policy and later announced a three-child policy in 2021. Despite these changes, many couples remain hesitant to expand their families due to the high cost of living, education, and housing. In the early 20th century, Belgium took over colonial administration in Rwanda and introduced a system that would have devastating long-term consequences. In the 1930s, Belgian authorities began issuing identity cards to all Rwandans. These cards categorize citizens by ethnicity, Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa, based on physical features, social status, or cattle ownership. This formalized what had previously been more fluid social categories into fixed legal identities. The cards soon determined who could access education, employment, and government positions. Tutsis, seen by colonial powers as more elite, were initially favored, deepening resentment among the Hutu majority. Over time, especially after independence in 1962, power shifted to Hutu leadership, who used the same ID system to marginalize and persecute Tutsis. By 1994, the ethnic identity card had become a weapon. During the Rwandan genocide, Hutu militias and soldiers used ID cards as roadblocks to identify Tutsis, many of whom were killed on the spot. With these cards, a person's ethnicity could be easily and immediately confirmed, removing any possibilities of hiding or escape. Nearly 800,000 people were killed in just 100 days. After the genocide, the Rwandan government took strong measures to eliminate the divisive legacy of ethnic identification. Ethnic labels were removed from all official documents. New laws were passed banning discrimination and divisionism. The identity card was redesigned to reflect only national citizenship, removing any mention of ethnicity. Rwanda promotes a national identity under the principle of I am Rwandan. While ethnic tensions still exist in private and historical memory, the removal of ethnic ID cards resulted in a major step toward reconciliation and national unity. Pakistan's blasphemy laws are among the harshest in the world. They were originally introduced during British colonial rule, but were significantly expanded during the military regime of General Zia-ul-Haq in the 1980s. These laws criminalize any perceived insult to Islam, the Quran, or the Prophet Muhammad. Under Section 295C of Pakistan's Penal Code, anyone accused of insulting the Prophet can be sentenced to death or life imprisonment. The application of these laws has led to widespread controversy. Although the state has never officially executed anyone for blasphemy, more than 70 people accused of it have been lynched by mobs before their cases could be tried in court. Many of the accused belong to religious minorities, including Christians, Hindus. The laws are often used to settle personal disputes, seize land, or silence critics. In many cases, even false accusations have resulted in fatal violence. Human rights groups have consistently warned that Pakistan's blasphemy laws are vague, open to abuse, and have created a climate of fear. Even lawyers, judges, and activists working on blasphemy cases often face threats to their lives. Despite global pressure, efforts to reform the laws have been met with fierce resistance from hardline religious groups. Thank you very much for watching this video, and if you learned something, make sure to leave a like. Comment down below your thoughts on any of the laws I discussed in this video, and subscribe if you would like to see a part 3 or more videos like this one. Thank you again, and goodbye.